The Radical Secular Podcast. A demand for justice, equality, and rational public policy. Subscribe at YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and all the major podcast channels. Visit our website at theradicalsecular.com for articles, transcripts, and our complete library of episodes. Support us on Patreon, and follow us on social media.
Welcome back to the Radical Secular Podcast. I'm Sean Prophet.
I'm Drew Scott.
Today we're going to talk about the issue of capital punishment along with the other methods of social control that are used within small groups and our larger civilization. And we'll be doing it through the lens of Richard Wrangham's pivotal book, The Goodness Paradox. If you've been following our podcast over the past year, you'll remember that we've done 3 episodes about this before. We've worked our way through the book a few chapters at a time. This will be our final installment in this series, which began with episodes 29, 31, and 36. We've been through chapters 1 through 7 of the book in detail. Today we'll cover chapter 8 as well as the afterword, which is Dr. Wrangham's short and definitive statement of his position on modern capital punishment. There are more chapters in this book, 13 altogether, but they just go more in depth on the topics we've already covered about human self-domestication, etc. So if you like our series on this, we highly recommend that you take the time to fully digest this book on your own. Today, we'll discuss the strong parallels between human domestication in small bands of hunter-gatherers and the culture of honor, violence, and retribution in the television series Sons of Anarchy. We'll also discuss the news, including the Delta surge in the COVID pandemic that's impacting all of us and an evolution in our position about the embattled New York Governor Andrew Cuomo. Yes, that means we made a wrong call, and we're always going to admit that to our listeners when we find out new information. We care more about standing up for truth and justice than being right every single time. But first, I want to remind you to please make sure to subscribe, leave a review, and tell your friends to listen. And also head on over to our Patreon page at patreon.com/theradicalsecular. We'd really appreciate your support, even if it's just buying us a cup of coffee every month. We have support tiers from $3 a month on up, and new episodes post Mondays at noon Eastern on YouTube and all the major podcast channels. We also publish new articles weekly in our journal at theradicalsecular.com. And speaking of the journal, this week, our co-host, Joe Acapinti, posted the first installment of his 5-part series on the 5 currents of power, discussing some of the details of the different political and socioeconomic divides beyond mere right versus left that have shaped world history during the past few centuries. He breaks down authoritarianism versus libertarianism, statism versus anarchism, capitalism versus socialism, to name just a few. We're excited about that series, and we hope you all enjoy reading it. Now, before we get started on our show, I want to announce the names of our newest Patreon supporters, and we couldn't be more excited to have them. We have big plans to build a strong secular community around our Patreon, and though we waited a long time to get this started, we're excited to interact more closely with our most loyal fans. The Patreon page doesn't look like much yet, but we're going to be building it out as we grow. It's never fun asking anyone for money. We do this podcast because we love it. And of course, any money we raise is going to go straight back into first paying our hosting costs, which add up, believe it or not. And then as we get more support, that money will go straight into growing and building our network. So thank you to Ken Cobb for supporting us at the $9 a month tier. Ken's a longtime Facebook friend and listener. We talk a lot online, and he's always supportive of our work and full of his own insights. So thank you again, Ken. And we also welcome Doug Berger, host of The Secular Left, to our Patreon team. He's also at $9 a month. Doug interviewed Christoph and I on his podcast a few weeks ago, and that episode is now live at secularleft.us. Thanks for having us on your show, Doug, and thanks for your support. It means a lot. All right, now let's get to the t-shirts. Drew, what are you wearing today?
I'm wearing an Obama Hope parody shirt that features General William Tecumseh Sherman.
Yes, I love that. And I love your Sherman Saturdays too.
Yeah, I do posts on social media about General Sherman, or just, civil rights and the Civil War in general, every Saturday. And, General Sherman is a complicated, controversial figure for a lot of reasons. And, I try to project a version of him that, is the fiery force of vengeance that's turning the slave owners to ashes. Whereas in reality, he kind of did some not so great things to Native Americans after the war and all of that. But at the same time, we probably wouldn't have won the Civil War without him. So it's a complicated figure. but he enrages the Confederate sympathizers and the far right, assholes of today. So I use him as that sort of symbol.
You really can't find a pristine character in history, and all you can do is hope that somebody is more on the side of right than less. And it's often the most conflicted, morally ambiguous characters that make the biggest difference, I think. And, I think, General Sherman should have kept marching. I think he should have burned Atlanta. I mean, I think he should have done a lot of things, but,
I agree.
Hindsight's 2020.
Yeah.
Okay, well, my T-shirt today is it really covers this whole issue of deplatforming, and I'm taking a bit of a different stance today, and that is to give Nazis a platform, and I think you'll see what I mean in a second. That is a nice guillotine platform, and that is where we think all Nazis should go, because the only good Nazi is a dead Nazi.
Gallows also works, also an acceptable platform.
And gallows humor is good too.
Yeah.
All right, well, so let's get into the news. I first am going to talk about it's obvious, the Delta variant. We're headed into an unprecedented surge of COVID cases, which is almost entirely a pandemic of the unvaccinated. The latest 7-day average of new daily cases in the U.S. is 101,000. Okay, daily new cases, and the 7-day average of daily COVID deaths is now 440, but we've been up as high as 650. So these figures are according to Worldometer. The surge is serious and strong, and as we know, deaths lag new case figures by as much as 3 weeks to a month. So we could be headed for daily death tolls that meet or even exceed the horrific numbers from January 2021, when about 4,000 Americans were dying every day. So let's try to understand what's happening. There are several things that are different with Delta. Even if you've heard all this, I want to drill it into everyone's heads, because you're all going to be dealing with pushback from friends and family, not just over vaccines, but over the facts of the situation. Everyone is an expert, it seems, not. And you need to be able to give them real information that could save their lives, even if they don't want to hear it. This is where we're at right now. So the first thing we have to talk about is R0, and the R0 of the original COVID-19 virus was about 2.5, meaning that each person who contracts the virus will pass it along to an average of 2.5 other people. The Delta variant has an R0 of 3.5 to 4, according to YaleMedicine.org. So everyone who gets it is going to pass it on to between 3 and 4 other people. It might not seem like too much more, about a 50% increase in the R0, but it's much worse than it seems, because when you're talking about exponential growth, each of those 3 or 4 other people are going to pass it to 3 or 4 more other people. And so the wave builds much faster than our hospitals can keep up. So
it's like the worst Kevin Bacon game ever.
Yeah. Or Mousetrap or whatever. So there's also this concept you have to be aware of viral loading, meaning how much of the virus is contained in your bodily fluids, which include the tiny water droplets that you exhale. This is something that a lot of mask opponents don't seem to understand, that, sure, the virus is too small to get through your mask, but the water droplets aren't. And so that's what your mask captures and prevents from spreading into the room. So with Delta, the viral loading is up to 1,000 times higher than the original COVID virus. 1,000 times. I mean, it's hard to imagine. But that's according to nature.com.
That's frightening.
And here's why that's important. The guidelines for masking and staying 6 feet apart were designed around the original virus, and they're going to be much less effective when you're talking about 1,000 times more virus particles floating around. It's truly scary stuff. And you absolutely need to mask up again in public, even if you're vaccinated, because you can be a carrier of the virus, even if you only have mild symptoms or no symptoms. The beauty of the vaccine is that if you're vaccinated, even if you test positive for COVID, you're only going to get a mild case, which is known as a breakthrough case. And from what I've heard, though, people who've gotten these breakthrough cases say it's still fucking miserable. So, you just don't want to take any chances with this. But the truth of the matter is, though, is that almost no one who gets the vaccine is going to end up on a ventilator or dead. People will say, well, if the vaccine works and masks work, why do we have to worry about Delta? The reason is because you could spread it to someone who's not vaccinated. And this is especially a concern for children, because there's no authorized vaccine for children right now at all. And it turns out that a lot more kids are getting Delta than the original COVID. Some of them are dying. We're seeing children's hospitals fill up in some cities. Today, I read a story on CNN about an 11-month-old baby who had to be airlifted to a different hospital because there were no more beds available. And this is very, very serious because, kids can't get the vaccine. They won't give it to them. So they're literally staking their lives on the adults doing their jobs. And school starts for a lot of kids just a week or two from now. So what we really have to keep in mind about the virus is not just keeping people from dying. The real danger is that the longer the virus circulates in the wild, the greater the chance of an even worse mutations happening. So we're already dealing with the Delta Plus variant, and the first case of the Lambda variant has been seen in Texas. Both of these new variants are thought to be more vaccine resistant than current formulations than Delta is. So we're looking at best case, everyone's going to have to get a booster shot or a third shot. Worst case, at a COVID variant evolving that evades our vaccine defenses entirely. It's entirely possible. So here's the thing you have to remember about viruses. They can't reproduce or evolve on their own. Their entire life cycle relies on the availability of hosts in which to replicate. So the longer this pandemic of the unvaccinated continues, the higher the chance of more cycles of transmission. The only truly safe way to put an end to COVID is for everyone to get the vaccine. There's probably no greater imperative in the world and no greater threat to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness than COVID right now, aside from possibly climate change. So one more thing before I finish up. Scientists are finding out more and more about so-called long COVID, which refers to the lifetime effects of surviving this disease. You can look up the symptoms and they can be severe. From lung problems, kidney, liver, heart problems, loss of smell and taste. These effects are debilitating and in many cases can shorten people's lifespan. But here's the real kicker. COVID attacks the brain. Early results are that so-called COVID brain fog can shave an average of 7 IQ points off a person's intelligence, and there's every indication that this brain damage is permanent. So what do you think, Drew? I mean, how have you been feeling over the past week about this news?
I mean, we talked about this last week. I just think that we need to get a lot more, frankly, draconian and forceful about this than a lot of Americans in particular are willing to get. I don't care if it's the carrot or the stick. I don't care if it's, hey, we give everyone who's vaccinated $100. I don't care if it's you can't get on a plane or a train or get a driver's license or get a job or go to school without a vaccination. I don't care what it is. We got to do everything at our disposal to make these people do the right thing, because this is ridiculous. I'm getting tired of this. We should have beaten this already. We could have beaten this already if everyone had just gotten the vaccine as soon as it was available and continued to socially distance until that ran its course. We'd be in a much different place today than we are now.
Yeah, it's so funny because I'm looking at some of the things Republicans are saying, and some of it's just hard to believe. Like there was something that came out of Texas where they were giving guidance to schools saying that, well, if a student, has been in contact with another student who's COVID positive, they can come to school. Or the anti-mask mandates, basically, of governors making it illegal for school districts to require masking. And it's just like, we've all talked about this until we're blue in the face over the past year, and it's kind of hard not to be repetitive. But I mean, what are we looking at here with this Republican Party? Who are they? Yeah,
I mean, I saw Ron DeSantis trying to tell Biden that he wasn't in a place to tell him anything about COVID because of the border, quote, something like that. He's trying to equate, this manufactured issue of the border crisis to Biden's authority on the COVID issue. It's just nonsensical. It's like you have to just kind of laugh. But, he's their potential front runner in 2024, this guy.
Yeah, I mean, does DeSantis realize that Florida's surrounded on 3 sides by water? I mean, like, what's going on here?
Yeah, he's ridiculous. Just another Trump simp.
Yeah, well, what really kills me about this is this kind of continuing parade of patients and their families that recognize too late that they screwed up. I saw an interview with a nurse whose mother died, and she had to beg her father to get vaccinated. And he only listened to her and agreed to get the vaccine when she basically screamed at him, "Dad, I'm not going to bury another one of my parents." The whole thing is just yikes, man. A final note, and then we're ready to, be done talking about COVID for today. We're expecting, at the very least, the Pfizer vaccine to receive FDA approval by the end of the month. And that should take away one more excuse, I guess, from the unvaccinated.
Yeah, I mean, not that they had any valid excuses to begin with. I mean, the only people with valid excuses are people with legitimate weakened immune systems who cannot be vaccinated, the kind of people we're trying to protect with these measures.
Right, but I guess I should have said pretext, because they'll just, if it wasn't that, they would make something up, but at least it takes away one kind of more logical roadblock that they throw up.
Absolutely.
All right, well, we got to switch gears now and talk about Governor Andrew Cuomo. And this is just a terrible story, because we love our Democrats here on the Radical Secular, and we hate to see an otherwise good Democrat taking a huge fall. But we got this one wrong. Before the investigation, we were looking at the accusations being made against Governor Cuomo, and we were frankly concerned that they just might be another Republican hit job. It's happened before with Senator Al Franken and, of course, Representative Katie Hill. We didn't think that Cuomo should have resigned before the investigation, but now the investigation is over and there's a whole lot more damning evidence that's come to light. And I'm going to quote here from an article in the New York Times. The article is called "Completely Violated. Women Describe Cuomo's Groping and Intimidation." It begins with a reporting on the release of a 165-page report that came out last Tuesday by New York Attorney General Letitia James. The report includes some pretty graphic descriptions of the governor touching and making wildly inappropriate sexual comments and innuendo to about a dozen female subordinates, including female state troopers responsible for protecting him. I mean, that one really just got to me, right? These women are protecting your safety, and they're not safe in your presence. I mean, it's mind-boggling, but it's not the worst part. Okay, the worst part is that Cuomo knew he was doing it, and he knew it was wrong. The evidence of his knowledge is that when he made these inappropriate comments and touched women, he specifically told them not to say anything to anyone about it. And it wasn't just him personally. His office actively suppressed and derailed the reporting of the abuse to proper state authorities. And I'll quote from the New York Times. "To exist as a woman in Mr. Cuomo's orbit," the report suggested, "was to live the dichotomy between fear and flirtation. A space where the boss could toggle between intimate and intimidating, and where his senior-most aides seemed to operate with a singular focus on the governor's reputation and personal comfort. In fact," the report says, "as Mr. Cuomo sexually harassed women inside and outside his government, greater pains were taken to protect him from himself. The executive chamber declined to report harassment allegations from an executive assistant, Charlotte Bennett, to the appropriate state agency, and moved instead to establish a practice preventing certain female staff members from being left alone with the governor. The composition of his circle, in the report's telling, was likewise intended to minimize exposure for Mr. Cuomo and accentuate a culture of fear around confronting him, with access granted chiefly to those with a proven personal loyalty. Those with Mr. Cuomo's ear included state employees like Melissa DeRosa, his top aide, and outside advisors like his brother Chris Cuomo, the CNN anchor, with no formal obligation to the state. The result," investigators wrote, "was that employees who are not part of this inner circle of loyalists would rightfully believe, and did believe, that any complaint or allegation about the governor would be handled by people whose overriding interest is in protecting the governor. So bleak were the options available to Mr. Cuomo's victims," witness interviews showed, "that even unwelcome sexualized attention could be seen as a better alternative to the otherwise tense, stressful, and toxic experience in the executive chamber." End quote. I mean, Drew, I just think this is awful. But how do you respond to it?
I mean, I'm reminded of Anthony Weiner, honestly, and that whole thing. Another guy who on the surface seemed like a solid Democrat. And then we find out all this stuff that's like, no, dude, you are a fucking creep. And it sucks because on Fox News right now, this is all they are talking about. And they are morphing the Democratic Party into the Cuomos.
Right. Right. And it's the bottomless pit of bad faith, right? I mean, fortunately, we've heard these reports before about powerful men, and I'm just wondering what it's going to take to turn the corner on this so this doesn't keep happening for Democrats, because we know the Republicans are hopeless. This is a gold mine for them because this is their party in spades. I mean, they've got 50 people guilty of this shit, right? And we've got
Matt Gaetz.
Yeah, Matt Gaetz for one, but I mean, it just goes on and on. I mean, there are so many scandals in the Republican Party, and there's so many people on the religious right taking the fall every other week. It seems like. I mean, wasn't there just one who was arrested for child procurement or something? I mean, it just happens repeatedly. Okay.
Yeah, they have no moral leg to stand on. I mean, this is the same party that nominated a racist, cartoonish game show host to be the head of their party. So who has a slew of sexual assault allegations against him, on his own. And so it just boggles my mind that they feign this outrage, but I get it. They have no morals. So they'll do and say anything to try to score political points, especially with the midterms coming.
Yeah, and it's a bonanza for them. We give them this bonanza, and that's why I think we have to be extra cautious as Democrats. And Cuomo, when he got up there, he made a statement after the report came out that was so tone deaf and so full of denial and deflection and whining about how painful the process has been for him and his family. And then he goes and releases a series of photographs, including President Obama and President Biden hugging people, as if to say that he had done nothing different, when it's absolutely obvious and just glaring from this report that he was engaged in not only really creepy behavior, but a cover-up. So, Biden isn't having any of it. His response was to ask Cuomo to resign, and we agree. That's why we've made a meme that says, heave ho, Cuomo's got to go.
Yeah. It seems like he's going to try to fight it out, at least for now, which is incredibly frustrating, and I think back to a year ago when everyone was praising him for how, he was kind of, leading the nation essentially through the COVID crisis. But then I realized that a big part of that was because we just had a huge leadership vacuum in this country. We had Donald Trump, who was up there telling lies and telling people to inject disinfectant and take hydrochloroquine and it'll be over by Easter and all this crazy stuff. And, there was no one just leveling with people. And, we now know about, the nursing home stuff and now all this. It's very disappointing and frustrating. And,
anybody who could get up on TV in a suit and not engage in science denial was like a breath of fresh air, right?
Yeah. I used to say that I could, walk out in the street and pick someone off the corner at random, and they would be a better president than Donald Trump. So, I mean, I get it. He and Newsom, I think, kind of were guiding lights for a lot of people through the pandemic with their straightforward conferences and stuff. But in hindsight, it's like I said, it's very disappointing, very frustrating. I wish he would resign. He's making us all look terrible.
Yeah, and I'm hearing all this pushback from Democrats saying, "Oh my God, it's a Republican plot." No, all right. If he resigns, we get Kathy Hochul, I think that's how you say her name, who is the lieutenant governor. She's a Democrat, and she takes over, and then somebody's got to run next fall, right? That's how this works. And I think sometimes there's this tendency, very much like Republicans, of Democrats just to circle the wagons. And, we've been very vocal here at the Radical Secular about not criticizing Democrats unnecessarily. But this is a situation where we have a clear path forward. We have a Democrat who can take over. And there's no reason not to hold this guy accountable, because if we hold this guy accountable, then Fox News loses their talking point.
Yeah.
The longer this guy is in office and remains in office and is defiant, the more they can accuse us of being hypocrites.
Yeah. Even though they're the hypocrites, and we all know that, it's just they have absolutely, rock bottom has a sub basement basically with these people. So,
It doesn't. Gavin Newsom is suffering some of the same kind of criticism for going out to a restaurant without a mask early in the pandemic, and that's got the recall going. He's suffering to the point where we may actually see the governorship in California turn over, and this is really scary because I've been reading that the polls are now in a dead heat for this recall, and a lot of it has to do with a lack of voter enthusiasm. And everybody's getting a mail-in ballot in California, so there's no excuse for any Democrat not mailing that damn thing in and keeping Newsom in office, because I got to tell you, if a Republican gets in right there, they have an opportunity to monkey wrench California, do the same thing to California's elections, same thing to COVID policies. I mean, the idea that was just unthinkable up until a few weeks ago that Newsom might lose this thing.
Yeah, I mean, I remain optimistic. I don't think Californians will go that way. I remain hopeful of that, but we'll see. I hope they do the right thing.
Well, the Republicans are going to be highly motivated. So if we don't get at least half of Democrats returning their ballots in this thing, the Republicans will win.
Yeah, I mean, I'm registered to vote by mail and have been ever since they made that an option here in this state, and it's great. It boggles my mind that that's not more widely accepted or more popular. That it's not just a national thing that we do for every state. Just mail the ballot and mail it back. I mean, if it's safe to mail the driver's license that you use to register to vote, it's safe to mail the ballot. That whole anti-mail-in ballot argument is complete bullshit.
It's just more bad faith. They're just looking to throw up roadblocks, and they're succeeding in a lot of places. All right, well, best of luck to California. Don't fuck this up. All right, I wish I could vote, but I'm in Nevada, so. All right, let's move on now to our main topic for the day, which is capital punishment, otherwise known as the death penalty. Just a quick refresher, if you missed our previous 3 episodes covering the goodness paradox by Richard Wrangham, very briefly, Wrangham has established that in our divergence from chimpanzees on the evolutionary tree, humans have become much less violent, particularly in the domain of reactive aggression, which is hot or emotional aggression. It's why 100 human beings can mostly, note I said mostly, sit together quietly on an airplane. Obviously, this doesn't count the idiots who have to be duct taped to their seats because they're acting like assholes. Yes, that happened this week. But it's still rare. On the other hand, if you had 100 chimpanzees on an airplane, they would immediately start tearing each other apart without question. And that is because they have much higher levels of reactive aggression than we do. This change took place gradually over the past 300,000 or so years, and we refer to it as domestication. It's similar to the difference between wolves and domesticated dogs. It's not a matter of training or following laws. Modern humans have evolved to be less aggressive by nature than our distant ancestors. This goes hand in hand with an increase in proactive aggression, which is basically cold, rational, preemptive violence used to achieve particular goals or to prevent other violence. This would involve either individuals working together to commit organized crime, defeat a bully, or it could refer to warfare or state-sanctioned violence such as caning or the death penalty. But today we're going to talk about the death penalty both in modern terms and its role in our domestication. Wrangham begins his chapter discussing how the use of the death penalty evolved. In a particular case in 1820, a 16-year-old juvenile named Stephen Merrill Clark had set fire to a stable, and the fire destroyed several homes and other buildings. No one was hurt or killed, yet he was sentenced to death anyway and executed in a public hanging, because at that time, the death penalty covered a wide range of minor offenses. Only a year or two later, laws changed and he would have been sent to prison. His execution was one of the last in the United States for a non-capital crime only involving property. Now, we recognize this perfectly legal killing in the United States as particularly barbaric. It brings to mind a lynching or summary frontier justice in front of a hanging judge. The kid was 16. The fire was possibly an accident. We don't know. But the idea of executing a kid for minor arson seems insane to us now. But these kind of killings have been extremely common in our evolutionary history and civilization, and they're even codified into scripture as being, quote, sanctioned by God. And some of the offenses for which early American colonists in the 17th century could be put to death included witchcraft, idolatry, blasphemy, rape, adultery, bestiality, sodomy, and in New Haven, Connecticut, masturbation. You could be put to death for being a child of 16 or older who was a stubborn or rebellious son who smote or cursed a parent. And this is one reason why we're doing this show on the subject today, continuing to focus on the abuse of the death penalty, because a secular humanist approach tends to deplore state-sanctioned killings unless the crime is particularly egregiously heinous, like child murder or terrorism or possibly high treason. And the rationale,
voting Republican.
Voting Republican, thank you. We're kidding, of course.
Yeah.
But the rationale here is harm reduction, restorative justice versus retributive justice. Let's take the example of this poor 16-year-old kid. Had he lived, he could have helped rebuild the homes he'd burned. Nothing is learned or gained by such an execution, and the community loses a potentially valuable member. Another absurd example, you're going to laugh at this, that occurred in New Haven, Connecticut, was that after a one-eyed pig was born, a one-eyed man was executed for supposedly committing bestiality with the sow. I mean, these people were fucking idiots, and there's no other way to describe it. The mind just reels that they were so ignorant of biology that they would have made this assumption about a one-eyed man. It's kind of ironic because New Haven is now this Ivy League bastion where Yale University is.
Yeah, I mean, the irony is pretty overwhelming. But things change, I guess.
I mean, you just to think that somehow a trait could be passed from a human to an animal by it.
Yeah, I mean, it falls in line with, a lot of crazy superstitions that I think could be traced back to the Bible or any other period of time when, you used superstitions and myths and things to try to explain things that you couldn't explain because science didn't, make that kind of progress at that point in time. So
it's almost along the lines of thinking that, disease is an evil spirit and, divine punishment or something like that. It's that crazy. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that kind of thing.
Well, it's important to mention that execution for victimless crimes like blasphemy, apostasy, adultery, masturbation, and gay sex continues in the Maldives, Mauritania, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Somalia, Afghanistan, Brunei, Iran, Mauritania, and some northern states of Nigeria, also Pakistan. In addition, severe corporal punishment like caning and maiming, like cutting off people's hands, continue to apply to such minor crimes that probably shouldn't even be considered crimes in many countries. So obviously this type of legal barbarism is closely connected to the world's scriptures, including both the Bible and the Quran, and they're one of the most brutal outcomes of so-called theocratic law. It's why we harp constantly on the radical secular about the dangers of theocracy. Another peculiarity of early American capital punishment is the combination of vigilantism, summary justice, and the need for speed. Wrangham writes, quote, "It was not unusual for criminals to be hunted down by citizens, tried, convicted, sentenced, and executed in less time than the 4 days that were supposed to elapse after the pronouncement of a death penalty," end quote. I suppose here they wanted to get the killing out of the way quickly, lest cooler heads prevail and spare the condemned victim. Or maybe he gets rescued by a member of his family. I don't know. But the whole thing just seems like pure bloodlust to me. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. And I think that bloodlust carries into the modern world as well. You see it when there's a prisoner about to be executed at a prison and there's, pro-execution protesters with deranged let 'em fry signs and all that kind of stuff. It's the same kind of thing.
Well, and as we'll find out later, this relentless drive to execute people we deem a threat to society is buried deep in our evolutionary brains. And like you said, once someone is condemned, it really gets people going, right? They really get excited about this thing because they get to watch somebody die.
Yeah,
I think honestly, if they televised executions, people would pay big money to see it.
Oh yeah, I mean, if they could do gladiators, with the condemned, I think they could put it on pay-per-view with massive success.
Massive. Yeah, if you had imagine if you had MMA, but somebody, only one person comes out of the fight. Exactly. Well, according to Wrangham's figures from 1622 to 1900, there were 11 to 13,000 legal executions in the U.S. He documents an additional 10,000 lynchings, but that figure seems painfully low given what we know about violence during Reconstruction and up to the present day. I don't want to get too caught up today in talking about America's racially violent past. We've covered that before, and we will be definitely talking about it again in the future. But lynchings and state-sanctioned executions are a bit different in a really important way, since lynching could be considered violence against an out-group, while most state-sanctioned executions during colonial times were members of the white in-group, and it's in-group violence that led to human domestication. We're talking about tribes forming coalitions within their tribes to put down bullies and troublemakers. And that's the paradox of the execution hypothesis, which is referred to in the book's title, The Goodness Paradox. Our ancestors literally killed off the worst and most violent members of our species, leading to self-domestication, which has made us a better species. The reduction in reactive violence has led us to where we are now, where most thinking civilized people have concluded that the death penalty is counterproductive and we should leave it behind. It also kind of reminds me of the tension in our political systems. We know that Darwinian evolution made us what we are, but yet social Darwinism leads to terrible outcomes within civilization. So we'll talk more about this paradox as we move along, but I wanted to open this up for any discussion, Drew.
Yeah. A part of me understands the base instinct of like, you do something that's so extreme that violates the social compact in such a way that you should be removed, from society, from the human gene pool. Even there's a part of me that understands that, but the implementation of the death penalty, particularly in America, is so backwards and so wrong. And there's a finality to death that you don't get from having someone imprisoned. There's a reason we have appeals. And, I think of cases like the West Memphis Three or Amanda Knox in Italy. These people who are condemned by, the machinations of the system when science demonstrates that they are innocent, and they could have easily spent their lives behind bars or be executed. So the justice system is flawed, not just in America, but worldwide. And until we iron out more of those flaws, it's hard for me to jump on board with the death penalty just in general. Yeah.
As we're going to find out, as we talk about this more and more, we're going to see that the reasons behind they're often very, very flimsy reasons, and they could be false reasons, like the witch trials and things like that, or the Inquisition. These were all areas where authorities took matters into their own hands and committed organized violence against people who were innocent. And they didn't have DNA. They didn't have even a systematic process for collecting and presenting evidence. It was all so primitive, and it's just really, really hard when you cross that line between justice and vengeance and family feuds and all this kind of crap. So, all right, well, let's move on then to talking about capital punishment in small-scale societies. This wasn't a topic of scientific research until the 1980s. And in this section, we're also going to talk about the show Sons of Anarchy, which is, for those who haven't seen it, it's an organized crime drama about a violent California motorcycle club called
It's awesome.
Yeah, it's Sons of Anarchy is also sometimes abbreviated Sam Crow, which stands for Sons of Anarchy Motorcycle Club Redwood Original. And that's because they're, I guess they were in this fictional town kind of near the Redwoods. So
yeah.
I don't know.
And they're the original faction of the club as well,
which has many chapters throughout a lot of Western states.
Yeah.
And we've seen some of these same ruthless dynamics that are in that show in Italian mafia dramas like The Godfather or The Sopranos. Basically, these shows tell us a lot about how small tribes of people operating outside the law have established their own stringent moral codes that invariably include the death penalty. And these fictionalized dramas are based on a tight-knit group of people focused on family, honor, and survival. And they tell us an awful lot about how things were done in pre-legal human hunter-gatherer societies, which were usually composed of small bands of 50 or fewer individuals. And as I was, it's so funny because I'm binge watching Sons of Anarchy right now. And at the same time, I was prepping for the show and rereading this chapter. And I just couldn't help but note the parallels between the two scenarios. And there's another thing we have to discuss here. And that is, before we can even talk about this stuff, we have to debunk the notion of the noble savage. And that is that was the, I believe the second section of Steven Pinker's book, The Blank Slate. It was just talking about how really rough life was and how violent people were during our prehistory. And a lot of people have this idea that somehow primitive tribes were idyllic and everything was peaceful, everyone just got along. And the most laughable part of this is when you hear people talk about how hunter-gatherers had more time off and had better lives than modern workers. And I suppose it might make some sense if you don't count little detail like physical safety or having any rights at all to go against the group. But one thing is clear from this book, and that is capital punishment in small groups is a human universal. Anthropologist Keith Otterbein confirmed this, and another anthropologist, Christopher Boehm, later amplified his work reporting capital punishment in every inhabited continent, including among the Inuit, North American Indians, Australian Aborigines, and African foragers. And one key to understanding indigenous forms of capital punishment is that it often requires the unanimous consent of the community, or at the very least, a buy-in from the majority. We can relate this directly to Sons of Anarchy. You might recall that when a member of the motorcycle club, or MC for short, was found to have either killed another member or if he ratted the club out to the government, a vote was taken to see if that member should, quote, meet Mr. Mayhem. In other words, be executed for their crimes against the tribe. And the rule in the MC is that such a vote on capital punishment must be unanimous. For example, Clay Morrow, who was the president of the MC for the first few seasons, until he was ousted by his stepson, Jax Teller, for killing Jax's father and putting out a hit on Tara Teller, Jax's wife. He was unanimously voted out of the club, but when the vote came on whether Clay should be executed, one member voted to save him. I thought that was kind of amazing, actually.
Yeah, I mean, Clay was one of the better characters on the entirety of the show, I thought. He was a complicated figure because there were times when you sympathized with him, but he was still such a rat bastard that you kind of wanted him to meet Mr. Mayhem, through most of the series.
He is, I mean, Ron Perlman is a great actor and a great human being, and that's what makes it so hard to watch sometimes. Some of the stuff, the way he treated people, the way he treated his wife, and just his general depravity. It's hard to watch. And yeah, you did want to see him die.
Yeah, he did a film called The Last Supper that I thought was interesting about like a bunch of liberals who basically have a dinner party every week where they try to find like the most despicable, conservative asshole they can, and they have them over for a dinner party, and they kind of interview them to see how despicable they are, and if they find them irredeemable, then they murder them at the dinner and bury them in the rose garden.
That was a great film.
Yeah,
I love that film.
Yeah, but I remember Ron Perlman was kind of played like the Bill O'Reilly sort of right winger, Alex Jones sort of character, and he did an incredible job in that piece. He does a really good job as just playing an asshole in spite of being just a wonderful human being.
It's good because for him, I mean, I've never talked to him, never met him, but it must just be really great to be able to explore your dark side in that way, because most of us don't get to do that in civilization.
Yeah, for sure. I remember I can't remember the name of the movie, but he picked one role in one of his films because it had this monologue that was just like ripping on the Confederate flag, and like he said that monologue was why I chose to do the film, which I thought was really cool. So yeah, big Ron Perlman fan. He's badass.
Yeah, and he took some great pot shots against Trump when he was in office, which I thought was awesome. I mean,
oh yeah, he did not mince words. He was like Jeff Tiedrick or one of those guys who just ripped into him. Great stuff.
Yeah, well, it's interesting when we talk about Sons of Anarchy's approach to capital punishment. It could be lifted right from the Kung San from the Kalahari Desert, and Wrangham talks about this in the book. He says, quote, "The anthropologist Richard Lee studied the Juhoansi or Kung San, the famously peaceful hunter-gatherers of Botswana's Kalahari Desert. Lee reported how a community came together to solve the problem of a member of their group who had killed 3 men. The murderer's name was Twi. In a rare move of unanimity, wrote Lee, the community ambushed and fatally wounded Twi in full daylight. As he lay dying, all the men fired at him with poisoned arrows until, in the words of one informant, he looked like a porcupine. Then, after he was dead, all the women, as well as all the men, approached his body and stabbed him with spears, symbolically sharing the responsibility for his death. It is as if, for one brief moment, this egalitarian society constituted itself a state and took upon itself the powers of life and death." And end quote. I personally, I think this approach is key, that all members of the tribe shared moral responsibility for the death. It's definitely a precursor to the idea of criminal law and punishment by anonymous execution. Remember that in a firing squad, members don't know whether they are firing a real bullet or a blank, which helps to depersonalize the execution. Everyone in general has killed the condemned prisoner and no one in specific. So does this community approach to capital punishment resonate for you, Drew? And how does that compare to the modern criminal justice system?
Well, it's kind of like that saying, democracy can be two wolves and a sheep choosing what's for dinner. The firing squad analogy is particularly interesting to me because I think they're all guilty. They're obviously all guilty. I think that's just I don't want to say cop out, but just a dodge, of alleviating responsibility for what's taking place.
So you're saying, separate and distinctly from the idea whether or not it's a good idea for the state to kill people, are you saying that the agents of the state are equally culpable whether they fire or not?
I mean, if they're complicit in the whole program of it, I don't see why they aren't, personally.
I think the whole idea is so that none of them will ever really know whether they actually killed the person or not.
Yeah, on a personal level, I understand. For like the sake of their personal peace of mind, I get why they do it, but I don't think it in the broader picture alleviates their bigger responsibility and their part in the system.
Yeah, they're still an executioner, regardless.
Yes, that's basically what I mean.
All right. Well, now we come to the question of establishing guilt. And in tribal societies, it's anything but a formal process. Recall in Sons of Anarchy how he's read old letters alluding to his stepfather's culpability in his father's death, and he's ready to act and do something about this, but other members of the club keep saying to him, we don't have proof. And he knows he needs proof to take it to the table. So he's got to choose between either just murdering Clay and dealing with that blowback or getting a club vote to meet Mr. Mayhem. And so kind of hijinks ensue as he tries to find the evidence and enlists other club members to help him unearth the facts that he can bring to the table, which is a delicate dance for Jax, because if he moves too aggressively, he'll tip off Clay that he's under suspicion, and he needs to be able to bring this definitive proof that will result in a unanimous verdict. And I think in some ways this TV show, the Hollywood writing kind of fiction overstates the ethics of how these things are usually handled among criminals. I think maybe The Godfather is more accurate. I mean, they just shoot him, but the loyalty they show in this writing by Kurt Sutter of requiring proof and this drive for justice are almost, certainly influenced by our modern justice system. And they're trying to, kind of act as if the club has this, higher sense of morality. And what do you think about that?
I mean, I think it serves as interesting allegory. It's always funny to me. There's a lot of people who watch these kinds of shows, Sons of Anarchy, The Sopranos, The Wire, that are brilliantly written and crafted in a way that are meant to make you think about broader issues. But there's a lot of people who watch these shows just thinking, yeah, snitches get stitches, when the character, the lead character shoots the guy who's talking to the cops or whatever, So I think it all ties together for sure. Yeah.
The way they wove it, too, it's like so many times, Jax is trying to make a deal. Various other people are talking to the feds, trying to make deals. And then their whole, the entire cartel deal ended up being with CIA agents, so it's just sometimes it stretches credibility, but I do think that we still get a sense that there's honor among thieves, and there's definitely these are human beings. They're not monsters. I mean, they can be monsters one minute and extremely human the next minute. And they can break down crying. I mean, after they
Yeah. I mean, Kurt Sutter kind of laid that on pretty thick with the Otto character, I think there's that scene where he's supposedly going to talk, but he slams his head down on the desk to bite out his own tongue. I think that's nailing the point down pretty hard.
It is.
Yeah.
Like he couldn't still write, he could rat in other ways, right? But it was very symbolic. So many things in that show are symbolic, even the visuals, the way that Jax looked. I mean, they're very, very metaphorical, but okay.
That's not even to speak of the whole Hamlet, correlation to the whole story. I mean, it's very deep.
Exactly. And, you look in Mayans MC, and there was some, references to 14 Stations of the Cross. I mean, these guys they're very on point with their allegories.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's true for a lot of these crime series. Like I said, The Sopranos and The Wire and a lot of these, there's a lot more than just cops and robbers, bad guys and good guys killing and all that kind of stuff. There's much deeper themes to it.
No, it forces us to really think about who we are as human beings, and what does it really started with all of these anti-heroes from Dexter to The Sopranos to, all these shows. There's been dozens of them that I can't even name now. The Shield, right? And dealing with anti-heroes I just think it's so much better because things aren't black and white. It's like you started out the show mentioning General Sherman, and he was not a saint.
Definitely not. But, in left-wing meme culture, he's just kind of become the anti-Robert E. Lee, the anti-Stonewall Jackson, just because his tactics during the Civil War were so ruthless. But the systems and people he was being ruthless to more than deserved it. I mean, I think of those sepia-toned photographs of those poor slaves from that time with the scars on their back from the whippings, from the Ken Burns films and stuff. And I think, burn those assholes to the ground.
Well, that's just it. When it comes down to it, like there's a lot of, and we did this a little bit ourselves in this show, talking about Cuomo and wanting to hold a high ethical standard. But in the end, in the long game, what you really want is you want the good guys to be better than the bad guys at accomplishing everything. And that includes mayhem. Unfortunately, you wanted our guys to win World War II. You did not want the Nazis to win World War II. And in order to do that, we did some horrible things. We carpet bombed Dresden. We dropped the atomic bomb on we firebombed Tokyo. We killed as many people in Tokyo with firebombing as we did with a nuclear bomb. So we have not been wearing a white hat.
No, and I find the Japan one particularly interesting because I'm a big fan of Japanese culture. I'm a big into video games and anime and manga and all, and their import action figures, all that kind of stuff. Godzilla, you name it. I'm all in with that stuff. I think that Japan of today is a force for good in the world. And they have the second highest population of atheists and agnostics in Asia, right behind China. So it's worth acknowledging. They're not a perfect culture. I'm looking at you, whaling fleets, but overall, with their culture and their technology, I think they're a force for good in this world. But I don't think that you can say the same about the Imperial Japanese of the 1930s. And where that line, gets crossed, it's a tricky one because we dropped that atomic bomb, but they still were so fanatical in their stance that they still didn't surrender at that time, and we dropped another one, and then they finally surrendered, right? So it's complicated.
There's some question though as to whether or not, if we just given them a little more time after the first one, it gets so morally complicated there. The one thing that we can say, though, is that after World War II, both of the sort of imperial powers, Germany and Japan, turned into very, very, some of the best modern democracies that exist.
Yeah.
So,
absolutely.
Well, I wanted to say one more thing about and ask you, who you think is the worst villain in Sons of Anarchy?
Yeah, I mean, we talked a little bit about this before we were taping, and I think we're in agreement that the big bad of that show is Gemma.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Gemma.
And I remember when this show was airing, and on social media, there was a whole thing of are you team Gemma or are you team Tara, right? And it shocked me that was a thing, because I found Gemma to be so hateful. And I mean, don't get me wrong, Katie Sagal, wonderful person, great actress, did an incredible job with the role, but the character was so hateful, so manipulative, so vile, and so selfish, self-absorbed. Her idea of family and all of that was just really all about her.
About her.
It horrified me that there were so many people who identified with that, but I guess I shouldn't be surprised.
Well, if you watch any of the fan, chats and videos about The Handmaid's Tale, you get the same thing. Are you on Team Luke or it's like, okay, guys, we're talking about, this horrible situation, and you're going to pick a team. Okay. Anyway, yeah, I would have to agree that it's Gemma, and we see that as we get into the final season of the show, she's committed this heinous murder, and then she's pinned it on someone who was totally innocent and started a complete gang war that resulted in everything being burned to the ground. And she just literally destroyed everything she touched. And so, and that was her I think her best skill was misdirecting guilt from the guilty party, which was often her or somebody she was protecting, to an innocent party. And so it's a great segue into talking about how our human ancestors established the guilt necessary to execute a tribe member. Before we get into that, though, I want to read another quote from The Goodness Paradox. Wrangham writes, "So in many ways, individuals in these small-scale societies are freer than those in larger agrarian groups, where individuals are subject, in the words of the social anthropologist Ernest Gellner, to the tyranny of kings. But liberty has its limits. In the absence of domineering leaders, a social cage of tradition demands claustrophobic adherence to group norms. Gellner called it a tyranny of the cousins. The cultural rules are paramount. Individuals have limited personal freedom. They live or die by their willingness to conform. Gellner's cousins did not have to be literally relatives. Cousins in the context of a small-scale society is a metaphor for the group of adults whose decisions hold sway. Their power was absolute. If you did not conform to their dictates, you were in danger," end quote. So, sounds very familiar in the context of Sons of Anarchy. You're bound by these group decisions. You can't leave. If you disobey, you face mortal danger. And a lot of that danger comes in the form of gossip or information control, which is why we saw in SOA that Gemma's attempts to control the narratives were so deadly. The secrets she was protecting were life-threatening. Words spoken or withheld between club members became mightier than the sword. And this is also true in primitive human societies. This taboo on ratting goes way back. It's not just a taboo on ratting to authorities, but also against breaking the sanctity of the male tribal council. Wrangham writes about the initiation rituals for a young man, quote, "When he joined a men's society, he was instructed that if he revealed their secrets to women or uninitiated males, he would be killed. A tattletale could be killed by his father or brother. The male coalition was more important than kinship," end quote. And this has kind of tremendous implications, even in terms of our drive toward feminism and equal rights, because male resistance to female inclusion goes incredibly far back in our evolutionary history. So the vitriol and hatred we see today coming from so-called men's rights advocates has deep evolutionary roots. You were going to say something, Drew.
I was going to say that quote that you read just sounds like Nazi Germany, like everyone's, watching you. Everyone's watching each other.
But that's the reality of these small scale societies. And they were much more like this idea that they were just all these like little families, all, tribes sharing food. And it was so not like that. And I think so many people who don't appreciate modernity, they think that they would like to live in those times. And you trust me, you would not. You would not want to live in a hunter-gatherer society. It was brutal.
No, it would not be fun. Be pretty stressful, I think.
Yeah. So, I mean, and you see that there's just this tremendous drive that we're still dealing with, where men want to keep certain things away from women and, special knowledge. And we often stereotype gossip as a women's domain, but it's always been so much more than that. And men have played a major role in turning gossip into a deadly weapon. And all of this ties our human self-domestication into language, because, you couldn't plot and plan to kill someone if you couldn't talk, right? And so chimpanzees, they could kind of imply things, but the real dirty, down and dirty gossip and spreading of lies or getting together the coalition to kill requires language. So this is another quote from Wrangham. Chimpanzees sometimes kill adults of their own communities, but there is no evidence that they can plan to do so. As I discuss in Chapter 11, language seems necessary for planned killings of specific individuals. The criticisms and ridicule given in response to an aggressor depend on gossip for their conspiratorial power. When those gentler methods of social control do not work, people start floating the idea of killing the offender. For that, linguistic ability is vital and considerable skill is needed. Gossip solves the coordination problem by allowing individuals to test their feelings cautiously and to generate shared plans. Most likely, therefore, linguistic ability improved substantially in the Homo sapiens lineage compared to all other Homo. With that improvement came the ability for individuals within a group to form coalitions that excluded or ostracized a member of the group who had become a domineering aggressor. Those coalitions enabled human selection against excessively aggressive men. In short, the ability to murmur about how much we resent some other individual and to float the idea of doing something drastic about it has certainly been part of the human legacy for at least a few thousand generations. If competent language began to develop 500,000 years ago, its increasing social significance would help explain how our ancestors started controlling the alpha males and thereby bred a new kind of Homo. In this model of self-domestication, language was really the key feature of Homo sapiens that allowed many tools of social control, from gossip to killing. End quote. Drew, isn't this a really stunning thing to realize, how much of human history has been shaped by the use of poisonous language to generate the ill will necessary to galvanize a coalition?
Yeah, it's out of necessity that we, band together, essentially, right? So.
Yeah, and I mean, you weren't here for some of the earlier episodes on this, but the fact that we are who we are now as humans and that we can get along as well as we do has everything to do with the fact that we just eliminated like the most violent members, and so
it's like dog breeds that came from the gray wolf, right? So over generations, only the ones that are most gentle and mellow towards humans are the ones that get bred, right? And over generations, you get, the Chihuahua.
Yeah, we talked about this. We talked about this regarding foxes in one of our earlier episodes. There was a whole breeding program experimentation that went on with foxes, and actual body changes in the shape of their skulls, changes in their fur, changes in patterns accompanied this domestication syndrome. And humans have done the same thing. But then we sort of evolved that. Now we've brought that forward into our civilization, where we, gossip is a thing. I mean, it's still a thing. You can still take down careers. I mean,
yeah. Especially now with the internet.
Yeah. Well, and if you're guilty of some crime or offense against the community, your very best play to survive might be to float gossip that would get someone else blamed and killed. And we saw that with Gemma. And she convinced Jax with a few words to torture and kill an innocent man. And that whole thing started a brutal gang war. So all that violence just, put into motion with just a few words. And this, to me, really helps crystallize the conversation about hate speech versus free speech. Because when we understand how much language can be weaponized and the role that hate speech has played in fomenting countless genocides and massacres, from Armenia to the Jewish Holocaust to Rwanda and elsewhere, we really have to consider whether this Enlightenment tradition of absolute free speech is wise or even compatible with human flourishing. Isn't it just too easy to weaponize language?
Yeah, I mean, we talked a little bit about this last week, in relation to COVID and COVID misinformation, is that ideas have consequences. I think that the First Amendment needs another look, just like the second one does. I don't think that absolute freedom in any of these contexts is the answer or necessarily virtuous. I think freedom needs context to be a virtue. And in the context of, as you said, of someone spreading a rumor that leads to a gang war where people are massacred, obviously that has consequences, even though we're talking about fiction. It just kind of shows the ripple effect, right? So I think that's what it boils down to.
Well, and you can see, our founding fathers had no idea about the role of, it's kind of funny because in some ways they did, because you hear this in the church all the time. You hear people, you hear churches constantly condemning gossip, right? And saying, but I think they do that more because they want to be the center of power. They want everything to go through the priest. They want everything to be run, in a top-down way. And gossip allows a community to bubble up grievances from below. And so gossip is always a precursor to revolution. It's like hugely important. And, I want to underscore the point about planning and conspiracy once again, that gossip could be seen as the genesis of all human politics. And the cliche, the pen is mightier than the sword, is really being seen right now with what's been going on the internet in the last 25 years. Rhetoric, secrets, propaganda, information control. And this is what Wrangham points out. He clearly says that even in the animal kingdom, weapons were not needed for capital punishment. He says, quote, "Animals such as wolves, lions, and chimpanzees kill using collaboration, not weapons. Humans can also kill without weapons. The ability to plot together rather than the ability to make weapons surely determined when the change occurred in the balance of power between the classic alpha male type and the new coalition of subordinates." Because what he says earlier in the book is that at a certain point, people figured out that that if you got enough people together, they could kill any bully, no matter how big he was. And so that was when the power shifted. Okay, continuing with his quote here. It's an example of what psychologist Michael Tomasello calls shared intentionality, defined as collaborative interactions in which participants share psychological states with one another. If the hypothesis that selection against reactive aggression led to the domestication syndrome is correct, however, none of those human abilities was as special as the one that enabled conspirators to trust one another sufficiently to collaborate to kill a bully. End quote. So, Drew, I want to talk about how we differentiate our understanding of how capital punishment was used in small-scale societies versus how governments use capital punishment today.
Well, I think a line can be drawn in the jury system, right? Like we're just kind of pulling from society essentially randomly for the jury system and entrusting them with that level of responsibility to kill another human, either with weapons or without, right? So I think that's a pretty direct correlation right there.
Yeah, I've never been all that fond of juries myself because I think it's easy to sway a jury with rhetoric. I think that we've seen this happen many, many times, and it's like this is sort of a holdover from our past. We think that if 12 people agree on something, that it's just.
Yeah, I mean, we saw that wasn't true during the O.J. Simpson trial, right? I mean, clearly guilty, overwhelmingly guilty. That bastard basically cut his wife's head off and stabbed that poor man to death, and got away with it because people were angry at the LAPD and they went with their emotions and their feelings about what was going on at the time, and however they felt about the prosecutors and the defense and all that. They went on all that instead of the clear-cut evidence of the situation, which is pretty scientifically sound. I mean, you don't need to be a biologist to hear those 911 calls and know that killing her was the next step, right? Like, and all that theatrics about the glove. The glove don't fit. You must have quit. Like it's all theatrics. It's all emotion, and it doesn't speak to the truth of the matter. And it's and to entrust that power to a group of 12 people who may or may not understand DNA, may or may not understand, these sorts of things. I think kind of speaks to what you're talking about. That sort of small scale tribalism that we're discussing.
It is, and we've seen. I mean, it was George Zimmerman, but and countless hundreds or thousands of black people who were condemned by all white juries, or white people who were acquitted by all white juries of killing black people. I mean, it's just there really has never been real justice. It's all been based on this innuendo and convincing other people to go along with something, right? And if you get 12 people, now you're legit. Now you can murder someone,
Yeah.
Well, I want to read Richard Wrangham's afterword because he has a very strong statement. He makes a strong statement about capital punishment in general. And then we're getting close to the end of our time, but I want to run a couple of examples by you and say, can we make exceptions to this?
Absolutely.
So here we go. Here's what Wrangham has to say. Quote, "The theory presented in the preceding pages suggests that our ancestors inadvertently created a more peaceful version of themselves, partly by killing the most aggressive males. This means that capital punishment is a natural behavior that produced morally attractive results. Does that imply any social recommendations? Does it mean that we should embrace executions as a way to improve society? My answer is a resolute no. Whatever the contributions of capital punishment once were, they are irrelevant to the question of justifying its use today. The administration of the death penalty by the powers of the state is very different from its use in small communities. Consensus is no longer required, nor is the killing performed as it often was by close relatives. Conditions have changed. Prisons offer alternative forms of social control that our ancestors did not have. I believe that judicial execution is an outmoded punishment that should no longer have a place in the world. Capital punishment is generally found to be ineffective in that it does not lead to a reduction in crime. It is more expensive for society than imprisonment. In some countries, such as the United States, it is strikingly unjust because it targets the poor and disadvantaged. And it makes mistakes. Innocent people have often been put to death. We can understand our past, but in this respect, we should not admire it. The evidence that capital punishment has had a long and creative prehistory is irrelevant to contemporary societal questions." End quote. So, what say you?
Well, I think that's a pretty solid way of looking at it. I definitely value that perspective. I liked Hillary Clinton's take on the death penalty personally, where she basically said that she did not trust the states to implement it responsibly, but that she was willing to make exceptions for very extreme, specific federal cases. And the example that she gave was Timothy McVeigh. Mm-hmm. It's hard for me to make a case that man should still be on this earth.
Yeah,
it just is. Other than the base level that he's a human being, which, I mean, so was Hitler. I don't know if that's enough. So it's a complicated question that I'm not sure I have all the answers to, but I definitely liked that take. That was probably the best I've heard it put that I would like to see that I've heard.
In a way, I mean, that's true because federal power would theoretically have the most legitimacy, right? If you have 12 people versus 30 people versus 100 people versus a whole state, right, versus a whole nation agreeing, right, on something, then, by proxy, of course, through the systems of elections. But because I think if you're looking at child murder, someone who's inciting genocide, someone who's committing treason against a democratically elected government, climate criminals who are lining their pockets and doing things that could kill billions of people. I mean, it suddenly becomes, when you really start thinking about totally abolishing the death penalty, I completely agree with it for any normal petty crime, up to and including, capital murder, right? But if there's extenuating circumstances like terrorism, like genocide, like treason, I think we have to keep it in our back pocket.
Yeah, I think that's about right. Like I said, I can't find a decent reason that Timothy McVeigh should still be around. Like for what purpose? What good does that serve anybody?
Yeah, and I have another question about this, and I'm just wondering what you think, because given what we know about how prisons operate and the horrific violence and corruption that takes place, prisons are basically, they're just full of gangs, and you have to join a gang to be safe, and guards are corrupt. And is that really much more humane than the death penalty?
I would argue that it is, because death has a finality to it. Once you're dead, that's it. If you're the victim of gang violence or, guard corruption or whatever in prison, there's still a possibility of you maybe getting out on appeal or, something happening, right? Something changing for you. But there is no change once you're executed.
That's certainly true. And I agree with that. But I think that as a society, if we want to claim that we're becoming more humane, it's not good enough to just throw somebody into a corrupt, violent prison, right? Because how okay are you if you're like repeatedly raped or have your eyes gouged out or some other horrible torture done to you? How much of your humanity does that actually take away and kill for good?
Yeah, and it starts to get into the territory of, is the purpose to reform the person or simply to punish them? Are you trying to rehabilitate them, to release them back into society? Or is it more of a vengeance thing where they did the thing and therefore they must do their time or what have you?
Well, I think a lot of people even make a joke out of it. It's like, go to prison. Oh, don't drop the soap. They consider that sort of torture and violence and rape is a part of the punishment, and they kind of rub their hands together with glee a little bit about it, just like you have people taking pleasure in an execution. And so, I really think that if we want to eliminate the death penalty, that we also have to reform prisons.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the two go hand in hand for sure. And I think there are a lot of European countries that have already, way ahead of us on this. But yeah, I don't think it's right to just say, okay, we're not going to kill you, but we're going to subject you to torture and who knows what, rape and beatings and what have you.
It is torture because, like, even if nothing actually happens to you, how well do you think you're sleeping in prison? For months on end, years on end, you can never get a good night's sleep because you're always afraid it's going to, your number's going to come up. And I think that there's a whole separate discussion to be had, what you just mentioned about restorative justice, where, the criminal can turn their life around, help the victim, help make good for their crime. That's one thing. But even if we're just going to lock people up, you shouldn't be in fear for your life.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, great discussion, Drew. This about wraps up our time, and with that, also our series covering human self-domestication. I just want to say to our listeners that I cannot recommend this book, The Goodness Paradox by Richard Wrangham, highly enough. It's an essential part of your library, and it's going to forever change your perspective on who we are as human beings. And I also recommend that you watch the show Sons of Anarchy. If you didn't catch it the first time around, it's on, Hulu or whatever, and it's 7 seasons. I guess that's about 90 episodes in all, but it's well worth it to binge or just watch it over a few months if you have the time.
Yeah, I'm actually jealous of the people who get to binge watch it now, because I watched it week to week as it aired. So there were times where it was like, oh, what's next? And now people can just go right through it. So enjoy. It's really good.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of great lessons there about small scale societies, loyalty, betrayal. And you also have to see it as a kind of modern day Shakespeare, as you mentioned. And don't miss the follow-up, Mayans MC. It's a great show too. It's still in production now. I think it's going into season 4 next year. So any final thoughts, Drew?
Great discussion. I'm looking forward to more. I don't know. I think that's all I got.
Okay, well, that's our show for today. Remember, if you like it, make sure to subscribe, leave a review, support us on Patreon, and tell your friends to listen. New episodes post Mondays at noon Eastern on YouTube and all the major podcast channels. We also publish new articles weekly in our journal at theradicalsecular.com. I'm Sean Prophet. Thank you for being here. And remember, wherever you are, you can be radically secular.
Take care.
The Radical Secular Podcast is written and produced by Christoph Defoe, Sean Prophet, and Joe Okipinti. Logo and main title design by Tim Stetner. Post-production and original theme music by Sean Prophet. Special thanks to our support team, Lindsay Brightman, Jillian Sky Jacobs, and Lori Field Okipinti.